Hi, I'm Lee Kim. Today we're going to talk to you about a sensitive yet widespread allegation. An allegation that states Dodgers Shopton practitioners as Chinese spies. Together with me are Pastor Kong Jin Ai and Mr. Martin Chow. Before we proceed into the details of this topic, let me first talk to you about the Dodgers Shopton Ban. This is not any new news to anyone. But let's have a look at the basis of that ban. Since 1996, the ban was all about the practice of Dodgers Shopton being bad for Tibet, it will shorten the life of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And it is clearly stated in the resolution of 1996, the resolution of the Tibetan Parliament in Exile. There are many things they say here with regards to the practice of Shopton, but I would like to highlight this. We would like to clarify that if individual citizens propitiate Shopton, it will harm the common interest of Tibet, the life of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and strengthen the spirits that are against the religion. Now, so it makes it very clear what all this anti-Shopton is about. In 1997, the resolution continues to be against the Shopton practice. In addition, they add, the joint disinformation campaign of China and a small number of Shopton activists should be challenged within the framework of law. And then again, the Chinese government's politically motivated support to a handful of Shopton activists and their disinformation campaigns in Tibet and outside world should be challenged effectively. So therefore, from 1996 to 1997, the ban, which originally started because it harms the Dalai Lama and the cause of Tibet, suddenly within a year transformed to include China, to include saying that China is involved, therefore stating that Dodgers Shopton practitioners are Chinese spies, Chinese funded. When a government's resolution states these, it becomes fact. Name me a government who doesn't put facts into the resolution, that doesn't put law into the resolution. So, when people read this, what do they understand? Ah, this must be fact. Oh, it is enforced, so therefore it is law. So what has happened from writings like this? The media has reported and articles have been written globally to narrate, to say, to implicate, to state that Dodgers Shopton practitioners are involved with the Chinese or the Chinese are funding the Dodgers Shopton practitioners. Martin, how much of all this is true, especially coming out from the media?
Well, Lee Kim, in a word, none of it is true. Now, what we have here is a very good example of post-truth and fake news, which has become quite common. We keep hearing about that in the news recently. But in 1996, when this first came out, as you correctly said, a lot of people assume that it is true that the practice of Dodgers Shopton would harm the Tibetan cause, would harm the life of the Dalai Lama, and is in fact a political tool of the Chinese government. Let's start by understanding what post-truth is. Post-truth politics is this political culture where debates are framed based on an appeal to emotions which are disconnected from facts, which means these are the debates that would arouse certain sentiments, anger, fear of the people. And in so doing, the purveyors of this post-truth or fake news sidestep the need to show proof and evidence and factual documentation to back up what they say. One good example of this is Brexit, wherein the UK, the people of the United Kingdom, voted to leave the EU. Now, the post-truth culture is such that it was said that the EU membership was costing the British people some £350 million every week. And that was repeated over and over again to the point where the British people, in fact, voted to leave the EU membership. And it was only after the decision was made that they realized that they had no idea what they voted for. Now, in very much the same way, this suggestion that DS people work for the Chinese are traitors and are spying for China is this CTA invention, a propaganda that has been allowed to circulate very, very freely. Now, what is interesting is that in these 20 years, when this allegation of Dodgers Shopton people being Chinese spies have been spread very widely, it's around the same time when the CTA has created a number of controversies. For example, with the two Karmapas, with the Rangzhen versus Umei Lam debate, and also with the Panchen Lama issue as to which is the real Panchen Lama. So, together with this accusation of Dodgers Shopton people being Chinese spies have come together, and in that confusion, the Tibetan people forgot to ask, what is the CTA doing to get them home? And how the CTA has broken promises after promises for over 60 years. So it is a very sneaky way of the CTA to get people focusing on certain things, charged with emotions. And it is very emotional because anything to do with China would strike a very, very sore point with the Tibetan people. And that was leveraged to the hilt in this accusation.
So, what you're saying, Martin, if I understand you, is that the Central Tibetan Administration in Dharamsala, North India, is appealing to emotions of the people and inciting emotional responses that nullify logical thinking.
Very much so.
That nullify the need to ask for evidence or facts.
Correct.
That's actually pretty dangerous for a government. Yeah. Pastor Jinai, earlier I mentioned how the Central Tibetan Administration in Dharamsala had amended or added to their resolution from 1996 to 1997. So my question here is, why was there a need to change justifications to ban a religion?
Well, what you mentioned about the progression of the resolutions, Lee Kim, is reflected in how the ban has actually progressed since it was first enforced in 1996 all the way up to the present time. In this, you can see that multiple resolutions have actually been passed in the Tibetan Parliament and exile, each one condemning Shukden practitioners, but each one also progressively changing the content of each resolution. You've seen multiple initiatives on the part of the Central Tibetan Administration, who are the Tibetan leadership, to enforce and institutionalize the segregation and the discrimination that they direct towards Dodgers Shopton practitioners. And throughout this entire last 20 to 22 years, the Central Tibetan Administration have actually changed their reasons for implementing the ban and to justify the ban. It's changed many, many, many times. And each time they've presented a new reason for justifying the ban, it's always been proven false. So first they started by saying that, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, his life will be shortened, his health will be harmed if people continue to practice Dodgers Shopton. Well, in the present day, His Holiness is a very healthy 83-year-old and does not show signs of aging or slowing down. He's bright, he's alert, much what many 83-year-olds would want to be health-wise. Then the Tibetan leadership changed their reasoning for implementing the ban. They said that by continuing the practice of Dodgers Shopton, you harm the Tibetan cause. Well, a lot of people have given up Dodgers Shopton. The Tibetan leadership have been very successful in implementing the ban, and yet they are no closer today to making sure that their Tibetan people can go back to Tibet. So clearly, getting rid of the Dodgers Shopton practice from the community has no bearing on whether the Tibetan leadership are successful in accomplishing their political goals or not. So despite everything that the CTA have directed towards Shopton practitioners, even by 2008, many monasteries were still continuing to practice Dodgers Shopton because they just did not see that there was any spiritual basis for banning the practice. And as a result, this led His Holiness the Dalai Lama to enforce even stronger sanctions against Shopton practitioners, going so far as to expel monks from the monastery if they refuse to give up their Shopton practice. Then 2014, 2015, 2016, what you see is the Tibetan leadership releasing videos, publishing books, sponsoring publications, all directed against Shopton practitioners. And all of them make mention of how Shukden practitioners have this so-called alleged link to the Chinese leadership. But I hate to tell you this, they've never produced a single shred of proof or evidence to back up their assertions.
Based on what you're saying, the CTA, Central Tibetan Administration, is really putting a lot of effort to upkeep this Dodgers Shopton Ban,
Yes.
and to constantly fuel it,
Yes.
to constantly incite it, provoke it, to keep it alive, to keep the hostility, to keep the discrimination, and which also results in violence and a lot of suffering for the Tibetan people. They spend a lot of time and effort doing this. In fact, getting themselves even, like you said, releasing videos, getting media coverage. It is a lot of effort to put into a cause to cover up the real thing, which is their lack of efficiency, their broken promises. It's pretty scary, if you ask me. Anyways, after Pastor Jinnah has shared how this ban was developed and, shall we say, progressively enforced in India, I would like to know now, how did this whole Chinese spy allegation get so blown out of proportion?
That's a very good question, Lee Kim. And we have to remember that whilst news outside China is more easy to access, that what happens within China is a bit more difficult for people to read and understand. But when the Dalai Lama imposed this ban in 1996, we have to remember that the Dalai Lama wasn't just a king, he was a god and a king to the Tibetan people. So whatever the Dalai Lama says is in fact law, or has always been regarded by the Tibetan people to be law, which they have to obey, both as a decree from a king and also a spiritual instruction of someone who regards the Dalai Lama as a Buddha. So with this, the instruction to stop and to make people stop the Dodgers Shopton practice was carried into China, into the Tibet Autonomous Region. And what is interesting is that a report by the Human Rights Watch 2004, and we have to bear in mind that this is not a document, these are not documents and research done by Dodgers Shopton people or people who have any interest.
So it's fully independent.
Very independent, and in fact it is slightly against China. But what is interesting that it does document that there was a ban that the Dalai Lama imposed in 1996. And as I've just said, whatever Dalai Lama says translates into law. So within Tibet, within the Tibet Autonomous Region, there was this split between people who chose to carry out the Dalai Lama's instructions and the people who chose to carry on with the Dodgers Shopton practice, because we have to remember that it is a very ancient practice that has been passed on over many centuries, and it's not so easy to give up. So what you have here is a situation where there was this division and unrest, and the Human Rights Watch report also documented that there were people strongly advocating the Dalai Lama stance on Dodgers Shopton, and they were preaching, they were taking steps to make the other people stop or to abandon the practice. All this translated into social unrest within the TAR, Tibet Autonomous Region, and a lot of communal disturbances. Precisely what China fears the most. What China fears most is unrest like this that will spread to its border regions and then creates a whole huge mess for China. And by 2004, we already see that there's considerable unrest because of the Dodgers Shopton issue. Now, 10 years later, this has been brewing for a whole 10 years. So the Chinese government did what any government would do, which is to take steps to pacify the unrest and disturbances. Now, to that end, the regional Chinese government put out some documentation, some literature to say that because the Dodgers Shopton issue has become the source for unrest, it is now necessary for the Chinese government to address this issue as a matter of priority. Their objective, as I mentioned before, is to stop the unrest.
From growing to become a huge mess.
Precisely, because it's just been brewing up over 10 years. Now, we have to remember that all this is picking up from what Pastor Jinai has said, that from 1996, there has been this ongoing effort, escalating efforts on the part of the Central Tibetan administration.
Very progressive.
Correct. To continually inflame sentiments surrounding this issue. And that is played out in a bigger way in the Tibet Autonomous Region. So, of course, the government stepped in to just say we have to put a stop to that. This literature has been taken and misinterpreted on purpose by the Central Tibetan administration as the smoking gun to say that the CCP, the Chinese government, is behind this practice, which is quite ridiculous. We have to remember that the Dodgers Shopton practice began in the 17th century, a long time before the Sino-Tibetan conflict.
Very long time.
And also, a very interesting point is that this accusation of Shopton people working for the Chinese only became common in around 2014, not before. So we have to remember that they didn't start banning this practice because it was found that Shopton people were working for the Chinese government. It kind of like evolved into that because they ran out of other credible reasons. And it was a long time after the Dalai Lama imposed a ban before they decided, okay, we've got no more excuses, so we're just going to say something which we know is going to get the Tibetan people upset, going to get them angry, something which we will not have to come up with any proof because it is such a highly charged issue.
Picking up what Martin said, 2014 is also the year that the Tibetan leadership officially proclaimed Dodgers Shopton practitioners as criminals in history, and the basis of the ban therefore shifted from the practice being harmful to His Holiness the Dalai Lama over to Shopton people being Chinese spies. So they stated this, actually it's captured within the resolution that they passed in 2014 by the Tibetan Parliament in exile, and it actually reads, regarding Shopton practitioners, they are being deceived by the Chinese government through monetary and material incentive and are used as political tools. And then goes on to say, further recognizes also that De Gyal followers and others who have caused great harm to the faith and polity of Tibet under the Chinese government's ploy and in violation of the law of karma as criminals in history. So De Gyal being the derogatory term that they use to refer to Shopton practitioners. So the sequence of events in that year alone you see is this. You have the international Shopton community, protesters who start protesting against the ban in February of 2014. And then a month later, in March 2014, you have the Tibetan Parliament in exile issuing this resolution claiming that these protesters and all Shopton practitioners, in fact, are criminals in history. In May 2014, the Tibetan Parliament then issues 2 hit lists, essentially, lists of Shopton practitioners, prominent Shopton practitioners who had the courage, in our view, to protest against the ban, but in their view had the nerve to protest against His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And in this list, they
therefore warrant to be on a hit list.
Yes, warrant to be on a hit list, warrant to have violence directed against them. And this list contained pictures of the protesters. It contained personal information leading up to even details of their home address. So it's very clear to see that there's been a very concerted and consistent effort to malign and to label Shopton practitioners as so-called Chinese spies.
And criminals.
Yes.
Wow. Very, very malicious indeed. In 2015, you also have the media picking up news of this, and in my opinion, blowing it out of proportion. But hey, let's have a look at it objectively. The media picks up information and then apparently gives evidence by having witness statements saying that yes, it is true, the Chinese government is paying Shopton practitioners to go ahead full steam and continue to go against Tibet and go against the Dalai Lama. Surprisingly, these articles are actually quite convincing. They have so-called witnesses who have made statements and printed to say that, to confirm that such transactions are taking place to finance the movement of the horrible Shukden practitioners.
And one such witness was a monk by the name of Lama Tseta, who claimed that he was a very prominent Shukden practitioner who was very well connected. And he gave testimony saying that he has proof that Shukden practitioners have direct links to the Chinese leadership, receive funding and support from the Chinese leadership. He filmed this video in 2015, and this video was widely publicized and promoted by the Tibetan leadership. And Lama Tseta even added a dramatic bit at the end when he cried to show his loyalty to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. That scene, sorry to say, was widely mocked by both anti-Shukden groups and pro-Shukden practitioners because it was contrived, to say the least.
Well, I think it was if everyone can accuse everybody for everything, then you can say this is definitely a CTA-funded video.
Of course.
Definitely. And they're crying too.
Yes, and speaking of CTA-funded video, the video was actually filmed by a gentleman by the name of Damchu Nima, in his home, no less. And Damchu Nima is a former employee of the Tibetan leadership up till 2014-2015, in that period. But since then, he has actually changed his stance towards Lama Tseta. He's changed his stance towards the Tibetan leadership because he's grown to be so disillusioned with all of the scandals that he sees around him. And he's come to the point where he now calls Lama Tseta a liar and a society destroyer, I quote. And
so he's the person who filmed the video.
Yes.
Of Lama Tseta saying everything and giving evidence. I see.
And you really have to wonder if it's a video that you can trust because, first of all, Lama Tseta in the video admits that he took money from the Chinese leadership. Then he says that he was a Shukden practitioner. Now he's not a Shukden practitioner. He has proof, but he has never actually shown this proof. So you have to wonder, can you really trust a person who keeps changing his story and is very inconsistent with his story? The fact that Lama Tseta himself said he has proof of his allegations that Shukden practitioners are connected to the Chinese. And that's something that has actually led to Damchu Nima's disillusionment because Damchu Nima actually asked Lama Tseta for this proof repeatedly, over a period of time. And Lama Tseta was never able to produce that proof. And so Damchu Nima is someone, who was employed by the Tibetan leadership. Even he believes that when you make an allegation or you make an accusation such as Shukden practitioners are connected with the Chinese, you need to show proof and evidence. You don't just walk into a court of law, make an accusation against someone and then expect the judge to hand down a sentence based on purely your word. You actually need to show evidence that's, proving that someone is guilty beyond reasonable doubt. And Lama Tseta has never been able to do that because Damchu Nima witnessed that. It's actually led to him basically disbelieving the Tibetan leadership's assertion that Shukden practitioners have some kind of links with China. And what you see here is that the Tibetan leadership are extremely keen to condemn Shukden practitioners.
At all costs?
At all costs, yes.
Including falsifying information.
Including falsifying information, including not doing their due diligence on people coming out of the woodworks, making wild claims and accusations that have no basis whatsoever.
And creating their own definition of law to define who are criminals.
Exactly.
Whoa. Preposterous.
I just want to add on what Pastor Gina has said, that it is really quite ironic that here we have the CTA saying Dodgers Shopton people are taking money from China. And the only hardcore evidence of any Dodgers Shopton person ever receiving money from China is in the case of Lama Tseta. So he is confirmed by his own admission to be a Chinese spy, Chinese funded, and a traitor to the Tibetan people.
Yeah.
And the paradox is, it is upon the testimony of this that they are now incriminating and punishing other people who have not and have never and will never take money to mortgage their religious practice for any political gains.
The media continues to cover these Dodgers Shopton protests that takes place following the Dalai Lama. And, the way it is portrayed, that all this is to undermine the Dalai Lama. And then on top of that, it gives a very bad impression that Dorje Shugden people are like a sect, like mobs. What can you add to that?
Again, this is a very good example of the CTA being an administration that relies heavily on post-truth. The reality is there has never been a Dorje Shugden sect ever, or a Dorje Shugden group, as is alleged by the CTA now. You see, the Dorje Shugden practice has always, from the beginning, been only one practice in Tibetan Buddhism. Not the only practice. It is even safe to say that it is a considerably minor practice compared to a whole lot of other practices that one would receive from one's teacher in practicing Tibetan Buddhism. So there has never been in history a group, a Dorje Shugden group, which is own identity, which is separate, which is apart from Tibetan Buddhism. We have to remember, Lee Kim, that Tibetan Buddhism is, what, 1,003, over 1,000 years old. And since that time, there's not been many new inventions to Tibetan Buddhism. You don't just create new lineages and new practices.
Yes.
In fact, all the practices have been passed down over hundreds of years. If there was such a thing as a Dorje Shugden sect or a Dorje Shugden cult, which is different to Tibetan Buddhism, we would have heard of it. But we don't hear of anything like that. There was never in the spiritual history of Tibetan Buddhism, was there ever a Dorje Shugden sect. It was only after the Central Tibetan administration coined this term and labeled Shugden people as being Chinese spies that this so-called sect appeared. How did that happen? And here you have to really understand what is going on here. That calling it a sect, calling it a cult, calling it a group is their way of saying avoid these people because they are anti-Dalai Lama, they're anti-Dharma, they're anti-Tibetan Buddhism. Again, comes under this post-truth and fake news.
It is, I think, it's also a way of adding a lot of definitions so that at the end of the day, the Dorje Shugden practitioners just become outcast. And outcast completely from Tibetan Buddhism, completely.
Correct. Very interesting that here we have to refer to something which Mr. Luka Jam. Mr. Luka Jam is a Tibetan who was one of the candidates for the post of the Sikyong, the presidency of the Central Tibetan administration. And what he said, and bear in mind this is not the Dorje Shugden practitioner saying this, Luka Jam said that you cannot take a monolithic view towards Shugden practitioners. Essentially what he means is it is wrong to group them all together and say, isolate them and just call them a sect. And Mr. Luka Jam also said that there may be some who have been colluding with China, who have taken money from China, like Lama Cheta has admitted he has. And then there are those who are practicing Dorje Shugden by tradition, something which has been passed down in the family from the teacher for a long time. And these people practice Dorje Shugden, but they also love the Dalai Lama. They are not to be put together, and it is wrong to put them together. But the very idea, the very suggestion that as long as you belong to one religion or one group, you're instantly tarnished, you're instantly bad, is illogical. It is like saying just because you belong to a certain religion, you are immediately a terrorist. Just because your skin is of a certain color, you are very highly likely to be a criminal, to be stopped, to be cuffed, to be interrogated. Just because you belong to a certain gender, you are instantly weaker. You cannot command as high a position and pay as someone of other genders. And just because you have a certain sexual preference, you're immediately sinful, you are dirty, that the community should shun you, that you should be avoided and excommunicated. All these suggestions is really obscene. And to say this, and then to say that all Shugden people are traitors, are against the Dalai Lama, work for the Chinese, is just a really obscene assault on everyone's common sense. And it is ridiculous for the Central Tibetan administration supposedly a democratic administration to even suggest that. And it
Not
is-
only suggest, Martin, continue to fuel it year after year, adding more and more, fire.
Yes, if we take the view that no one should be judged on the color of the skin, the gender, the preferences, or nationality, as we all agree should not be the case.
If one was truly democratic.
That's right.
Correct? Or even, well, forget about democratic is right, but if one has common sense, okay, logically it does not stand that just because you are of a certain religion, just because you are of a certain skin color, you are immediately bad. The whole thing is just insane.
It also goes that everything that Martin's talked about, if you have any respect for basic human rights, that you would not segregate people on any of the points that Martin has raised.
Personal choice, freedom of choice.
Exactly. And to add to what Martin has raised earlier, that Dodgers Shopton people who protested were in their hundreds, and they do not represent the 4 million Shopton practitioners that exist all around the world. Martin earlier raised and talked about a gentleman by the name of Mr. Lukajam. And Mr. Lukajam was not the only person who said that Shukden practitioners are not a homogeneous group. Another author, Buddhist author by the name of Justin Whitaker, wrote on the website pathos.com that there is no one single Shukden organization that functions as an umbrella organization representing the views or the opinions or approach to practice of all Shukden practitioners around the world. And certainly, we here at Kachara, under the guidance of our guru, His Eminence Tsem Rinpoche, Tsem Rinpoche and Kachara have never participated in a protest. And therefore, to say that all Shukden practitioners around the world have the same approach towards campaigning against the ban, or even have the same approach to how they wish to maintain their practice of Doji Shukden, would be erroneous to assume that all of us are singular in this view.
I agree. Well, I definitely don't have associations with China because I'm a DS practitioner. For business, yes, for business, yes, but I don't get paid to practice DS.
And let me just jump in here just to say that the Central Tibetan Administration, for the good of their cause and for the reputation of the Tibetan people, should really stop saying this, because this habit of simply accusing opponents of being Chinese spies has been noticed, has been observed and picked up by global news. The Huffington Post wrote about it, and more recently Medium.com, which is a very dynamic website based in the US, have noticed how the CTA would very, very easily label people as Chinese spies, and have done so over time, just to get people to oppose the people that the CTA is trying to target. So they should really, really stop saying this, because it really makes them look ridiculous. It undermines the credibility of the Tibetan cause, and it makes a mockery out of everything that Tibetan Buddhism stands for, which is logic.
Quite frankly, using the word Chinese to insult someone else is in essence a racial slur. It's nothing more than that, to say that someone is bad to be Chinese.
Everything that you have shared, I'm sure I'm not the only one that's going, what? Seriously, it's like, it's mind-blowing how ridiculous it is. We as in Dodgers Shopton practitioners are accused of being Chinese spies. On social media, it's even nastier than that. Chinese dogs, yeah. It's rude. It's horrible. It's inhumane. Dodgers Shopton practitioners are accused of undermining the Dalai Lama. But if you think about it, the work that CTA is doing, investing their time, effort, and a lot of money probably to keep on promoting this Dodgers Shopton ban, and the things they're doing till this date in 2018, and publishing and putting things out there without evidence, is insulting. And if they want to talk about undermining, they are undermining the teachings of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Yes. Telling lies, having no compassion, dividing people. It's horrible, yeah. And also, I was just thinking, as ironical as it is, what's his name? The one who, the the tattletale, Lama Zeta. Before he said, oh, I don't practice Shukden, was he ever confirmed? He obviously testified against himself. He is a Chinese spy.
Yeah.
He received money. Was any action taken against him since it's the law in the resolution that he's a criminal?
Nothing. He's just been promoted and celebrated.
Been promoted.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
So, in today's time and age, obviously CTA has not, been updated how to treat people. All right. I'd like to add, this Chinese spy label used by the CTA is not unique to only the DS people. It is an old trick to incite violence and segregation towards anyone that the CTA considers to be not politically inclined with their views, or people they perceive to be political opponents such as Loka Jam, Rangzen activists, Mila Rangzen, an outspoken Tibetan, Member of Parliament Sarchok Kukta, and Dujom Rinpoche. So, back to the issue at hand. There has been no documented legitimate evidence presented to prove any DS practitioner as a Chinese spy. Hearsay by a monk, self-incriminating by the way, does not count as evidence. It is racist to use the term Chinese in this context all across the board. There are millions of practitioners who have nothing to do with China and would not appreciate being labeled a Chinese spy or even a Chinese dog. Interesting. His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, is making overtures to get closer to China. So, is the CTA going to start labeling him a Chinese spy too? With this, I will conclude this discussion and leave you with the knowledge to recognize facts and logic versus false allegations and prejudice.